a year, a life, all of those skeletons hidden in all of our closets, all of those things we have done and left undone, all of those things, all of those times we've not loved God or our neighbors or ourselves with our whole heart. We speak these words every Sunday, words of confession, words that ask God for the forgiveness that is so extravagantly given. See, this bank of grace has no borrowing limit, nor does it have any chance of going under. There's extravagant grace to be found here. And Jesus' story today is a story of that extravagance, a broadcast sowing of unimaginable forgiveness. Last Sunday was the story of community, and where we gather together in that community, Jesus gathers with us. That community is one that is always accountable to one another in their actions and their thoughts, in their entire lives, but the story continues. And Peter asks the simple question, Lord, how many times should we forgive? 7 times? Oh, Peter, you still haven't quite caught on. Not 7 times, which is already an incredibly large number when it comes to forgiving people who have hurt us. 7 is a good number, but let's turn it up a bit. How about 7 times 70? 490 times. Imagine the shock the disciples heard with this answer. Does Jesus want us to carry around a little notebook to keep track of all of the forgiveness we're doling out? Is this 490 times for the same thing, for the same person? What happens if we hit 491? Is that when we excommunicate them? And I'm sure Jesus sensed their confusion. And, as Jesus regularly does, he dives headlong into a story. And here's a king who forgives a slave the debt that he is obliged to pay after falling to his knees and begging for mercy. But the extravagant part of this story isn't just in the slave's forgiveness, but the amount of loan forgiveness he receives. A bit of math. This slave owed 10,000 talents to the king. Now, in those days, a talent was a weight of measure, usually for gold and silver and copper, and that weight added up to approximately 60 to 90 pounds per talent. With some easy multiplication, that's approximately 204 metric tons. And each of those talents would be worth about 6,000 denarii. A single denarius was the normal rate of pay for most servant workers, added up to a total of 60 million denarii. At the average rate, this servant would be working for the next, has anybody got the number yet? 164,000 years to pay off this debt. And we are not taking into consideration any vacation time. 490 may have startled the disciples, but this is just absurd. Now, indeed it is. We hear Jesus say, the amount of forgiveness that the king hands out, the constantly overflowing bank of grace, is absurd. It is enormous and hyperbolic and ridiculous and so much more than we can begin to fathom. The psalm we prayed together today showed us how far that debt has been removed from the servant, as far as the east is from the west. But Matthew's Jesus has parables that don't often end on an up note. There's always a sense of tragedy underneath, and the tragedy is easy to find here. The slave who was forgiven his debt of 60 million denarii went out to one who owed him money and threw him in debtor's prison. denarii. 164,000 years of work compared to a little over 3 months. How is it that the servant who was forgiven so much could go on being so unforgiving to others? How is it that the servant who was treated so extravagantly could possibly treat one so extravagantly poorly? The rhetorical answers to those questions tell us all we need to hear. How many times shall we forgive, Lord? Not 7. 70 times 7. We who have been given so much grace and forgiveness in our lives, we might call to mind some of those especially extravagant moments. Carry out forgiveness, because once you get the gift, you also get the giver. The result of our forgivenness is our forgiving. Our weekly prayer, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. As we have been forgiven, give us the strength, the will, and the Christ-likeness to do likewise. And we are so extravagant with our forgiveness in response to our forgivenness because community can't exist without it. If the church, Christ's body in the world, is about nurturing relationships and caring for one another, forgiveness pulls us back from the brink of destruction, the destruction of ourselves, the pain of closely held anger, the destruction of our world, to the curse of vengeance and reprisal, the destruction of Christ's body, to which we all belong. We need 490 times because we need the practice. We need 490 times because we are constantly in need of hearing that this too can be mended, that this too can be healed, that there is a better way to move into the future, to hope. Doc Hammarskjöld was the second Secretary General of the United Nations and a man whom the Lutheran Church celebrates this coming Thursday, September 18th, the date of his death in a plane crash while seeking peace in the ceasefire in the Congo. Here are his words about forgiveness. Forgiveness is the answer to the child's dream of a miracle by which what is broken is made whole again. What is soiled is made clean again. Forgiveness is letting go of the hope that the past might be changed and exchanging it for the hope that the future can be. Forgiveness is the healing of our communities, of ourselves, and the healing of our world. God, this is not easy work. Of course it isn't. Community, life, is hard work. Forgiveness is dangerous work. The Anabaptists were those children of the Reformation who disagreed with infant baptism and began rebaptizing people as adults. They were heretics not only to the Catholic Church, but also to the mainline Protestants, and their regular fate, when convicted of rebaptism, was to be burned at the stake, a common tool used against heretics, or being sewn into a bag and thrown in the river. The cruel joke of this distortion of adult baptism was not lost on the perpetrators. Dirk Willems was one of those early Anabaptists. He was convicted of his heresy and sentenced to die. By a twist of fate, though, he was able to escape from his jail and make his way across the ice-covered moat that surrounded the cells. While he was crossing, the jailer in pursuit fell through the ice and began to sink. Dirk Willems went back, pulled him out, and saved that jailer's life, only to be recaptured and burned at the stake a few days later. forgiveness is not logical or reasonable or easy, and this can often be forgotten. The sermon usually goes that because God has forgiven us, we must forgive others, carte blanche. And this extends in some places in the church to encouragement or flat-out demands to forgive abusive husbands and return home for another terrifying day. This extends to rape victims and abuse victims, told by some Christian counselors that they must forgive their rapists and their abusers. But you see, it's this cheap forgiveness that is especially dangerous. Forgiving doesn't mean allowing mistreatment. Forgiveness is always about love, and sometimes the most loving thing one can do is to no longer allow mistreatment. Forgiveness allows us to see something as wrong and to call it wrong. Forgiveness always holds people accountable, but holds them accountable in love and of hope for a better future, which may not always be returning home to an abusive spouse or letting those around you continually hurt you. The past few weeks have been a test of this lesson. We have seen ISIS continue a killing rampage in the name of a distorted and disturbed view of Islam. We've also remembered 13 years ago exactly where we were when we heard that our country was under attack and thousands had died. We have begun the steps again towards a war that we never really left. If there ever was a time for it, as Pope Francis reminded us this last week, humanity needs to weep, and this is the time to weep. I don't know what forgiveness looks like in those situations. What I do know, though, is that holding on to anger, refusing forgiveness, refusing to say that I will no longer allow you to hold me in fear, does make the destruction, the bombing, the madness of war much easier. It does give us some sense that we can still win. But there has never been a war with a winner. Nor is forgiveness ever about winning and losing. Forgiveness allows us to call something what it is. In this case, an awful evil on both sides. And to move forward in hope. And if it is up to me and my own strength to forgive others, I am lost. If it is up to any of us alone, we are lost. And so we come together to hear words today that remind us again that we are forgiven. That we are constantly living in the grace of a God who is always present where two or more are gathered, and that 490 times may seem like a lot, but it's only because we need so much practice. Because the world is in such desperate need of hearing it is forgiven. And in this practice, our lives are turned away from vengeance, and sadness, and anger, and retribution, and instead unlocking a future and a community of love filled with hope. As I close in prayer, I wonder if there might be one person or event in our minds right now that we could forgive and ask God for the strength to do just that and to do it again and again and again. Hear this prayer of Doc Hammerskill. Have mercy upon us. Have mercy upon our efforts, that we before Thee in love and in faith, righteousness and humility may follow Thee with self-denial, steadfastness and courage, and meet thee in the silence. Give us a pure heart that we may see thee, a humble heart that we may hear thee, a heart full of love that we may serve thee, a heart of faith that we may live thee. Thou whom I do not know, but whose I am. Thou whom I do not comprehend, but who hast dedicated me to my fate. Thou. Amen.